Hi, I am Nikki, and you are listening to the EduLeader podcast. This is a place to celebrate fantastic educators, and this is a place teachers can go to learn about amazing things happening outside their classroom. Hello, EduLeaders. This is Nikki Hyman, and you are listening to the EduLeader podcast. And today I am talking to my friend, Jason. Jason, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jason Shelangouski. I'm a teacher at Council Grove Junior Senior High School. I teach 7th and 8th grade ELA.
That is awesome. I have really enjoyed getting to know you over the last couple days that we've met at the Teacher Leader Cadre. I feel like you have had some really valuable insight to share with some of your classroom experiences because you teach middle school, but you coach high school. So you have that wide range of developmental levels that you work with kiddos. You've shared some information about some projects that you've done in your class that I think our listeners would enjoy. Would you mind sharing some of your project ideas?
Yeah, one of the ideas that I shared last time I was here was a project I called the Junk Project, where kids would actually bring in stuff from home that they just don't use anymore, and they would I would kind of separate it into different bags. They get kind of a mystery bag of stuff, and then when they get that bag, they have to decide, what they want to do with it, how they want to design it. If they want to make something that can benefit us, if they want to make something that's like a game. And actually, over time, it turned into they wanted to make games for kids. So we would actually hold kind of like a junk carnival where the kids would come in from the elementary school and they would play the games that these kids would create. But they would create things out of nothing, and it was always amazing to me. But then they started bringing in things like plywood and power tools, and I had to get that approved because I had 7th and 8th grade kids. Well, it would have been 8th grade kids using power tools to put these things together. But they learned an awful lot, and the kids had a lot of fun coming over and playing the games. But I mean, ultimately, it was the kind of the lesson of, with language arts, you have to be able to speak, listen, read, write, and one of the things that they struggle with really is speaking and speaking to people. And so this was a way for them to talk to kids. It was a way for them to kind of sell their product. And it was also a way for them to keep kids entertained for an afternoon when they would come over and do it. So they had a lot of fun, but it was also at the same time getting them to realize that, some people's junk or stuff that we don't use often can be somebody else's treasures. And we can turn that kind of stuff around and kind of have some fun with it. And that's what they ended up doing. It ended up being a pretty fun carnival for us.
So what were some of the games that the kids came up with?
Some of it was just simple things like they might have gotten a couple golf balls and some buckets and different things, but then they would, screw these things onto pieces of plywood to where it almost became like, the old Bozo the Clown ball toss game or something. But they were all very original. They didn't try to emulate or copy anything that they've ever seen before. It was just, what can we do here? And then I think one of the cooler groups actually on I think my last year at the previous school that I did this at too was they used some of the toys they had in the bag as prizes, and the kids, the faces they had when they get these prizes if they won their game and could walk around. It could have been a rubber duck. It could have been anything. I mean, it lit the kids up quite a bit just to see just something little trinket they could give to them made their day. So
that's great. I want to know a little bit more about how you tied it into the standards, because when I talk about project-based learning with educators, what I often hear is that there's a struggle with adjusting for time to do the projects because they are very time-intensive often. So how did you manage that?
Well, this was something that I usually did more towards the end of the year after I felt like we had just taken the state tests, and it was something that to kind of culminate some of the things we talked about. So when you do talk about reading and writing with this, they really did have to kind of read about some of the products they did have because maybe they didn't know what they were or best uses. When they had to write about it, they had to be able to, like I said, sell their product. So they wanted to write about, gosh, it got to about anything, but they wanted to write about, what the benefit was to have this kind of game or to use this kind of tool. But then the speaking and listening were the huge ones. And that was something where, anymore. To try to fit things like speeches and stuff into an ELA classroom, it becomes tough because you have a lot of kids with anxiety disorders, or they don't know what to say, and they don't want to stand up there and sound stupid, I guess is the way they kind of say it. And so you want to make them feel comfortable. And this was something where when they created it and came up with the ideas, they felt a lot more comfortable speaking to public, even if it was first and second graders or third and fourth graders, because we would actually do this for an entire afternoon where we do it in sections of elementary kids. And as far as tying it into standards, with any project-based thing that I've done, I used to actually do 6 solid months of writing too, because we also had split classes then where I taught a reading class, but I also taught a writing class. And so I was able to focus on the writing standards with writing or the reading standards with reading, but I could do it project-based where time wasn't really a factor. It was just a matter of are they getting what's needed from the material. For instance, right now in our text series, we have the play version of the Diary of Anne Frank, but I don't like the play version of the Diary of Anne Frank, and so we actually read the whole novel. And one of the things that I guess isn't so much project-based, more so it's my project, is after we get done reading that, I do kind of a Holocaust Museum walkthrough where I set up 2 spots in the room that are candlelit, and they have to go through. They come in about 5 at a time. They get an identification just like you would at the real Holocaust Museum, and they are that person. So they read about their early life and what happened at the war, and then they go and find out whether or not they lived and died. And they sit down, and one of the things I actually added into the lesson this year that was given by a colleague, or an idea that we kind of came up with, was before we even did this, we spent a day where the kids colored butterflies, just their personality, colored the butterfly. And we hung them up in the room, and I said, "Oh, it's great decoration, isn't it?" They're like, "Yeah." Well, then after that museum walkthrough, anybody who died, according to their card, had to cut down their butterfly in front of everybody. And there were a lot of tears shed. There were a lot of kids upset with it. But it was something real where we talked about, this is what I'm talking about when we talk about treating people with respect, or talking to people in certain ways, or leaving people out because of who they are, what they do. And so when we've been able to do that kind of stuff, it's been, it's project-based, yes, but it's at the same time, it's right up the standards, that we talk about with them, with speaking and listening, or, reading and writing about topics that are tough for kids to be able to take. So,
yeah, I bet that makes it really real for them.
yeah.
So I'm going to backtrack a little bit, but another question that teachers often have when we're talking about projects is how you assign a grade to something like that. So I don't want to minimize your conversation about the Anne Frank, because I think that's great, the museum piece. But how do you provide feedback, and how do you manage that piece?
One of the things that I felt like was one of my strong suits coming out of college was, in college they taught us quite a bit about rubric writing, and we spent a lot of time making sure that our rubrics were relevant towards the curriculum and the standards, but also to a point. We didn't want to leave any gray areas. And so when I was able to do this, this was something where a lot of people have asked me, how do you measure these skills? Well, it's harder to explain, I guess, because when I sit down to write a rubric, I think about my expectations, maybe what their expectations would be, and then what are the lowest set of expectations. But I was never somebody who gave D's and F's before. It was usually A work, B work, or C work. And kids did get D's and F's if they didn't get stuff turned in. But for me, as far as measurable, obviously it was always based around the standards. But I also look at it like, what kind of efforts are getting put in here? I wasn't an art teacher, so I can't really grade their artwork. But I know the difference between efforts and stick figures. And so those were things that I explained to them, and I think it made them feel a lot more comfortable with their end result, because I knew kids all weren't artists, or they weren't people who could put something together and make it look appealing with, say the junk project, or, when they did the butterflies with the, after the Anne Frank book, and it's just part of the Holocaust unit that we ended the year with. they knew their butterfly didn't look like everybody else's, but I don't, that wasn't something for me that was measurable. That was something for me that their reflection on it, their reflection on the activity was the measurable part. And they didn't care that I didn't even grade the butterfly part. They were more accepting of the idea that just the conversation alone to end that unit was huge for them. And especially with eighth graders going on to high school and they have choices on how they want to treat people or the things they want to participate in. I mean, that's it. Just I think it, like I said, for me, it varies from activity to activity on what I want to measure and what skills, because I can base that right around the standards or just things I'm looking for.
Another thing that I really notice about you is when you talk about the Anne Frank Museum, I feel like one way that really works for you is I can tell that you are very intentional about building relationships with your kids. You always circle back to that, and I'm really impressed by the amount of attention you take to make sure that the kids all feel valued. And
well, I teaching middle school, I'm very, very real with kids. I don't believe that sugarcoating things is always the right approach to do, especially with junior high kids, because I think there are grade levels where you want to get kids to understand and buy into the process of school and what you're there for. But when you get to junior high, to me, that's really the first part where they have to learn that, we're not holding hands much anymore. This is now we're starting towards that end result, which is a high school diploma, maybe a college degree or trade tech school or a job right away. But the thing that I guess I focus on is being absolutely honest. And I tell them up front that I'm going to be honest with them, that, and I might do it in different ways where I have side conversations, or I might pull a kid out or whatever and have those one-on-one times. But there's other times where, because they can tell that I'm very intentional with what I'm teaching or very intentional with what I'm talking about, even if it's just talking to somebody who interrupted our class or whatever, that you can tell they respect that within our classroom, that's just going to be expected. High expectations out of me is something that is definitely known, and I think kids want high expectations, but they don't always know the direction to go with that. And so if we can keep pointing it, especially at the junior high level, if we can keep pointing them in the direction that they want to go while still maintaining the high expectations, I think they gain a lot more respect for not just me, but anybody who has that kind of level of expectation for them, because they see that we believe in them.
how do you go about setting a culture? If you were talking to a brand new teacher right out of college who said, I really admire the way you run your classroom and the way the kids interact with you, how can I emulate that in my classroom? What would you say to them?
Well, in college, one of the things they talk to us about is, you can always start mean and back off, but you can't start nice and go to mean, because you're going to lose a lot of kids that way. And I took it to heart, like, well, that's kind of how I always felt like I started. Anytime, you want to lay down the ground rules so that way everybody has a chance to learn. But, if a new teacher asked me, I think that's probably the most important part, is that if you have expectations, you need to let them know right away. If you have the ability to, set the tone with your demeanor and how class is going to work, you need to do it right away. One of the things that I think is very valuable is I actually do a room walk with my kids the very first day when we have everybody, to show them just where everything's at, and my expectations and rules are a part of that. And it makes them feel like they're at home, that these are the boundaries, these are what we're trying to do. These are books you can check out. This is paper you can use. This is and you kind of just mix it all together. And I think for new teachers, instead of feeling like you have to be a deer in the headlights, you need to be the headlights, and you need to kind of show them that this is your room, this is your classroom, and understand that I have my rules, but these are things that society has for you too. They have rules too, and we need to follow those. And and I haven't had a lot of new teachers really ask about it. I have had some come in that were studying or current in education program, and like, wow, they really listen to you, or they really they don't talk a lot or whatever. And it's like, well, when they do talk, they talk a lot, but that's because that's part of the discussion. That's part of whatever we're talking about. because I'm a micro lecturer, which is something that not a lot of people do. I'm not somebody who can stand there for 45 minutes and talk. I have to do micro lectures to keep kids sane, I guess, at the junior high level.
How long are your micro lectures?
Honestly, when I talk about micro lecturing, I'll go 5 or 6 minutes of something. So let's say it's a story we're reading that day. I'll go 5 or 6 minutes of reading, stopping. I might do something like how I might read aloud, think aloud, kind of just to myself, so that kids see that adults do that kind of stuff too. But then I'll stop and I'll ask them a question and have them talk about it at their table, or hey, talk about what we just talked about here. So they're getting pieces of whatever we're talking about that day, whatever the lessons are that day. They're getting it 4 or 5 times a day, not just once from me. So that way, even if I get a little bit lengthy, kids don't ever raise their hand and interrupt because they're too nice. But I'll tell them, hey, I need to stop right now and let's talk about this. What have we talked about so far today? Just talk about it for a minute at your table. Hit the highlights. Did we talk about this, this, and this? What? Go. And I let them talk, and I think they're just they feel very, happy to be able to share those things. Yes, some of the conversations do get off topic, but then I actually have a call to order. I just say waterfall, and they all make the kind of the waterfall noise, and it's kind of just like shh. And so they get it, and they stop talking, and then we just reiterate, okay, what did we talk about? So now that's the 3rd time that they get it, instead of just me talking for the 1 time. So
I love that. I think about that in professional learning situations. I mean, even us adults, we hate it when we're in a PD and the speaker talks for 3 hours without taking a break. Nobody's attention span is that long. So I love how you give the opportunity to chat. That's something that I did as a teacher too, and now I hope that I'm doing that adequately as a professional development person. So I think that's great. I think you're doing great work, and I love to see teachers who are so passionate about education, and I think you have a lot to offer. So I think big kudos to you for all you're doing in the classroom.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. And if you know Jason or see him around, and I'm terrible. Can you say your last name for me again?
Yeah, it's Shelangouski.
Shelangouski. Okay, I'll remember that now. If you see him around, I think it's important to celebrate teachers and say, hey, thanks for the awesome work that you're doing. And he's definitely one that's doing great stuff. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me on the EduLeader podcast.
Thank you for having me.